Example of these two wonderful saints. Read about their lives, open a book and read about the lives of these two wonderful saints, go online and read about them, and enrich ourselves with the example of these human beings, and take that example and apply it to our lives so that we too can meet the Lord where we are. Not where we think we should be, not where we think other people should think that we are, but we will meet Him where we can, and He will come to us and He will meet us where we are. That's what the Lord does. He reaches down and He extends His hand and He finds us where we are. And if we take His hand, then all of us can reach sanctity as well. May God bless you. And again, Christos Anesti, Chronia Pola, Seus Yortazun Simera, many years to those who are celebrating their name day today. Amen.
You have been listening to iSermon with Father Theodore Paraskevopoulos. For more information on Saints Constantine and Helen Greek Orthodox Church, please visit www.stsconstantineandhelen.com. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Orthodox music, lectures, prayers, and more on Ancient Faith Radio. Thanks for your support.
This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Father Tom is the priest at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and welcomes guests from across the globe to discuss important topics of interest. Here's Father Tom.
Welcome to Ancient Faith Today. This is Father Tom Soroka, and I'm so glad that you're with us this evening. We'll be taking your calls in a bit at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Matushka Trudy will be answering your calls tonight, so please make sure to turn the show volume off before you come on air. To participate online, we encourage you to go either to the AFR Facebook page at facebook.com/ancientfaithradio and place a question there in the thread for tonight's show where it is being live simulcast. Or you can also go to facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday and place a question there in the thread for tonight's show. You can even send us an email at aft@ancientfaith.com. So let's get started. When I was growing up, the Orthodox Church was going through a unique period of tremendous growth, both numerically and in vision. I was fortunate to experience some of this from the front row, because my father, who was a priest, was deeply involved in ensuring that the entire church had music in the English language. And he often worked closely with church leaders to ensure that everyone was heading toward the same goal, realizing the vision of the Orthodox Church as an organic reality in North America, to move beyond simply being a church solely for immigrants of those of a particular background. In my late teen years, as I became more deeply involved in the church, a name was occurring frequently in discussions that I overheard: Father Alexander Schmemann. A prolific author and keen observer of church life, he became a key figure in recovering, renewing, and enlivening a vision of church life. While he was an intellectual and an academic, he also traveled to parishes and dioceses, widely inspiring the faithful with his talks, and inspire them he did. Generations of Orthodox believers have been formed and informed by his talks and writings. And yes, there may have been a few things that he wrote or said which were somewhat controversial, but everything that he said has to be weighed in the context and in the time in which it was written. And this does not at all diminish the immeasurable positive influence that he's had on the Orthodox Church and continues to have on Orthodox Christians around the world. So, here to discuss his life and work is the dean of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in Crestwood, New York, and a successor to Father Alexander in the leadership of that institution, Father Chad Hatfield. Father Chad is the president of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary, previously serving as the dean of St. Herman's Seminary in Alaska. He holds an MDiv from Nashotah House and a D.Min from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. His experience in various pastoral, teaching, and administrative roles spread over some 41 years of ordained ministry are now blended into his ministry of forming seminarians at St. Vladimir Seminary. Dr. Chad, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thanks very much, Father Tom. It's really a privilege to be able to share with you some very significant things about the life of the great name associated with St. Vladimir's, as you said, Father Alexander Schmemann. This is the centennial of his birth, so we're keeping the seminary focused on his teachings in a renewed way, which is easy for us to do because there's just so many angles, so much material. And we've discovered, of course, that his teaching and even his voice now resonates as much in 2021 as it did, say, when you were growing up, as you just reflected upon his impact. His impact as someone, as you noted, I've been told so many times, he was as comfortable speaking in the high school gymnasium in Monessen, Pennsylvania, as he was giving a lecture at Harvard.
It's really true. There are so many pictures of him where he was just speaking at normal parishes around the country and diocesan functions. And of course, he was really at the leadership, or at least maybe the leader behind the leaders in our own Orthodox Church in America. And all of those things are very important to understand his legacy. And so thanks for letting us know that. So I know that this is, how do we describe this man's work in an hour? It's really impossible. We could go on for weeks and weeks and months. But let's try to bring it all together and ask you, who was Father Alexander? Because there are so many people that have come into the church that maybe don't really know him, or maybe know him just through one or two of his books. Who was he, and why do you think he continues to be important today?
Well, as I said earlier, his message continues to be discovered by people. I'll give you just one quick example of that. An Anglican priest, Porter Taylor, in 2018, began the work on a faith shrift for Father Alexander. It's titled, "We Give Our Thanks Unto Thee, Essays in Memory of Father Alexander Schmemann." But this book actually reflects his great impact on the ecumenical scene. People in Reformed tradition, Anglican traditions, Roman Catholics, they're still discovering Schmemann for the first time today, and he's influencing their thoughts. Only 2 weeks ago, I became introduced to some Roman Catholic nuns in California. They're Norbertine canonesses, and their particular apostolate is centered around the liturgy and the ascetical life. And through David Fagerberg, an expert on Schmemann and a professor at Notre Dame University, he's been giving lectures to them, and they've been asking me, how can we learn more about Father Schmemann? So his ecumenical influence, again, is still very strong.
Yes, and you bring up the idea of ecumenism, and eventually we're going to get to maybe the mythology surrounding Father Alexander, because within the age of the internet, with people being very polarized, I almost hate to say this because I don't want to spoil the waters at all, but he does have his detractors, and sometimes that can be very strong, but I think it's based on a kind of a false view of his work and his thought. And my question would be about ecumenism. Would you say that he was an ecumenist, or simply that he was involved in representing the Orthodox Church in ecumenical gatherings?
Oh, I would say very much he was the person representing Orthodoxy to people who really had had no exposure to it. For instance, he was an official observer of Vatican II. But if you actually explore his writings, he was pretty critical of Vatican II as a source for what one might call innovative liturgics, because he actually was not an innovator. He was not part of liturgical renewal in that sort of Vatican II sense. He was a restorationist. He was giving the Orthodox back things which we had forgotten.
Yeah, so can you maybe articulate that a little bit? So what are some of the things that he brought to the fore? Because as I said, you know, I forgive me for maybe giving some of these anecdotes, but, you know, having this memory in my mind, of course, I was actually at seminary the year that he died. And so I understand this maybe from both sides of the chair. But my point is, I can remember growing up, of course, as I said, my father was a priest. When he would come out with the chalice, in the fear of God, with faith and love draw near. And of course, he said it in Russian as Church Slavonic at that time. Nobody came to the chalice. It was very frequent that nobody took communion. And he was the one that inspired people to understand the Eucharist in a way in which people were more willing to approach the chalice, correct?
That's correct. And it's things even like the pre-sanctified liturgy. If you talk to people, you know, our age and above, they'll tell you, oh, I was born and raised Orthodox. I never saw a pre-sanctified liturgy.
Exactly.
We didn't have those things. And of course, Schmemann helped us to understand the pre-sanctified liturgy. It became something in the evening because it is a vesperal service. Things like hearing the anaphora out loud. I mean, our salvation history is rehearsed for us in the liturgy. And again, he didn't invent that. He's just simply restoring what once was. And he would analyze, I think, very gently what one might call Baba theology or Yaya theology, a lot of things that just become like barnacles in how we worship. One of the things he helped us to do, and I think it's probably about a 1972 document in the OCA, reflecting on frequent communion, he helped us to understand that the pattern, which you will probably remember from your youth, one confession a year, one communion a year. Great and Holy Thursday was the time when you would make your communion. I remember Paul Meyendorff saying once that there was a Holy Thursday liturgy that was 2 hours late because the parish priest was hearing so many confessions. So it's those kinds of things which sort of crept in that you know, he helped us to not just recover and restore, but to really understand. You know, our current professor of liturgical theology, Dr. Vitaly Permyakov, who certainly represents the Schmemann tradition in liturgical theology, he's written a piece in our latest annual report, which is titled "The Need for Liturgical Theology," reflecting on Father Alexander Schmemann's vision. But, you know, he notes that the purpose of our ecclesial Eucharistic assembly is not just to fulfill our spiritual needs or to express our devotion to God, however important all of that is. Schmemann helped us to understand what does it mean to gather every Sunday in Eucharistic assembly. And he also helped us to put some things together. What we might call teleliturgics. I remember Archbishop Benjamin of San Francisco in the West saying, oh, you teleliturgics, that's how many signs of the cross you make and how many things you kiss and where. It's that kind of thing. It was Schmemann that helped us to integrate liturgy with theology and with piety in a kind of single, robust vision. So he helped us to understand the need for liturgical theology. And in this vision, the liturgy and the worship of the church, I think, really becomes more than just an expression of people's private piety or devotion.
Right. And I that is so important because again, it's a little bit hard to describe this, but, one of those issues was nobody went to communion. And we're talking about 1940, 1950, early 1960s,
yes,
before he really blossomed and came on the scene. And this kind of piety, which there's nothing wrong with piety, but this type of piety was replete in the church, and the idea that the liturgy was something that you entered into rather than watched from afar was really a new idea. Obviously
yes.
It wasn't new because it's in the authentic tradition of the church, but it was new to these people. And getting people to the point where they understood this, because he understood the mission of the church, was a tremendous feat that he really led.
Yeah, indeed. And part of that is, your own father's contribution in terms of church music. Father Alexander understood, liturgy was not a performance like going to opera. And the liturgy became like a symphony where everybody had a part to play. And we rediscovered liturgia as the work of the people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's remind our listeners that we would love your participation in this talk tonight. 1-855-AF-RADIO. If you'd like to call in with a reminiscence, if you'd like to call in with even an opinion or a question about the life and the thought and the legacy of Father Alexander, we would love to hear from you. 1-855-AF-RADIO. Father Chad, so Father Alexander was known as a liturgical theologian. Yes. And that particular idea, I think, is it's very, very specialized. It's very specific. And when we think of, I think when the layperson thinks of liturgical theology, they think, how to swing a censer, what direction, for the priest to go, what vestments to wear, and so forth. But I don't think that's what liturgical theology is. So tell us, in the understanding of yourself and the seminary, and of course the best of Father Alexander, what is liturgical theology?
Well, again, I'd refer everyone to this new article written by Father Dr. Vitaly Permiakov that's in our annual report. But he does a great job of addressing the fact that not only is it a specialty, but it's something that addresses every aspect of an Orthodox Christian's life, from the birth, baptism, the great moments in a person's life, marriage, the understanding of the Eucharist as part of the rhythm and the liturgical year and the liturgical month and week and seasons and day, the hours. All of this is part of the life in which we live. He helped us to understand that being Orthodox is not like, my preferred church denomination, but that it is in fact a way of living. It is right faith, right praise, right belief, all of these things. And it's tied also to mission. Many people don't understand the connection between liturgy and evangelism, mission and outreach. Some of the books, for instance, Church World Mission, it's remarkable as a missiological book. And then, for the All-American Council a few years back that had the theme for the life of the world, we reprinted, the great classic for the life of the world. And it has an absolutely beautiful preface by a mutual friend of ours, Edith Humphrey.
Yes.
And she certainly points out, that it's Schmemann that, for the life of the world, it serves as a succinct introduction to all of the other parts of Schmemann's work, the Orthodox approach to ascesis, all kinds of key topics. And all of that, as I said, is part of liturgical theology that helps us understand even the word liturgy. I would also add something here. He's also really known as a preacher, as a homilist. And in the Rangos building, where I'm sitting now, in the library, there's his report card from St. Serge that was given at his graduation. It's very interesting to me. His lowest grade is in homiletics. And that's one of the things.
Surprising.
That's one of the things that he's known for, So it
Very
says something
surprising.
about the education system, I guess. And I think that you and I know this too. His original academic passion was history, so he was able to actually, as he got into the historical study of the church, he saw that liturgy really was a theology that needed to be developed, not just simply something that was static, dead, and rote. Dead ritual.
Right. Yeah, I think that there was a thought, for instance, I believe there was a famous meditation written about the Divine Liturgy, and I think it was written by Tolstoy, but I don't remember. And it always saw the liturgy in sort of symbolic terms. Not symbol in the way that Father Alexander understood symbol and explained symbol, but symbol meaning, when the priest comes out with the gospel, this is symbolic of, him preaching the gospel. And when he lifts up the chalice, this is symbolic of, Christ going into the ascension, right? And that is sort of this kind of very elementary and really maybe even misleading understanding of the Divine Liturgy is often what he pushed against, because it reduced the Divine Liturgy to something that you watched instead of something that you entered into. And I believe that this is really part of his enduring legacy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Father Alexander's final essay on liturgical theology in 1981, it calls the church to resimulate the foundational goals of the popular liturgical movement that began in 1909. And that was sort of a date in which the Orthodox Church began to sort of rediscover the very meaning of the word liturgy and what it means to worship, to enter into worship.
Indeed,
so all of that, comes from his historical foundation that he was then able to develop into, a standing for which he still remains quite unique.
I believe so. There certainly, just in terms of his intellect and his outlook, he is unique in that sense, but also simply specializing in the way that he did, I believe that he is unique. 1-855-AF Radio, that's 1-855-237-2346. Father Chad, so, one of the issues here with Father Alexander, when he talked about the idea of the church itself, and I believe that this maybe somewhat touches on something that we're going through today. I have to confess to you, I didn't talk to you about this before, so I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot.
Okay.
We just went through COVID, and the tremendous challenge has been, how do we gather as the church without physically gathering as the church? I want you to go out on a limb here and tell me, how do you think Father Alexander would have confronted the situation with COVID? Because he was so adamant about the idea of the synaxis, the gathering. This was one of his fundamental teachings regarding the church, that this gathering was so important. It's anybody's guess, but what does your intuition tell you that how Father Alexander might have approached this whole subject of the restrictions and so forth?
Well, I never mind going out on a limb, especially with these kind of topics. Saturday at the virtual Ed Day, Father Joseph Honeycutt and I had a conversation about COVID and particularly the rise of catechumens. So many priests are telling us in their parishes they've got more catechumens than ever. But at the same time, so many people who have left the church during the pandemic and many who say they will not return. So my guess is that Father Alexander would have been obedient to the directives of the Church about how we move through the pandemic. And, hindsight's 20/20. We're already looking back and seeing where we made mistakes and other such things.
Right.
But I also would say that I'm sure Father Alexander would take this as a teaching moment to remind people of how precious that Eucharistic assembly is. How many times does he mention the kingdom? Over and over and over. In everything that he writes and talks about, it's the kingdom. It's pointing us to the kingdom. And he reminds us that, unlike certain Christian traditions, we aren't waiting for the kingdom. We're living it. We're in it. And we have that part. So I think he would use this as a time to teach, to remind people that, the TV screen is great. Podcasts and live stream is great, but it's not the same thing as the actual interaction that one finds in worship. And, if I may, I didn't have Father Schmemann as an actual professor, although I claim him as a teacher. I actually looked. My first Schmemann book was Of Water in the Spirit. It's an SBCK publication, not an SVS Press publication, but it's 1976. But I really do treasure my time with Matuszka Juliana. In her final years, she was nearby here at the seminary. It was so precious for me, to take her communion, to pray with her. And sometimes she would say to me, "Now, Father, I want you to sit down. There are some things you need to know." And I learned a lot of things. But something that has really touched me is her describing the way that he struggled to write what I think is his finest book, which is The Eucharist. Mm-hmm. She said it was so important to him to get everything just right. And when you read like his diaries and others, you see how he struggled. And in fact, he never completed it. It was completed posthumously after his death. But the preface, as a priest, I would say this to every priest listening, get the book. And from time to time, when you forget your priestly identity, just read the preface. It's 2 pages. And particularly, it's addressing how we live in a very now secularized age. He was like a prophet in predicting what was coming down the pike. The sort of rise of neo-paganism, all of these things.
Interesting.
Where he said, it can be said without exaggeration that we live in a frightening and spiritually dangerous age. It's frightening not just because of its hatred, division, and bloodshed. It's frightening above all because it is characterized by a mounting rebellion against God and his kingdom. I mean, those are absolutely the words of a prophet.
It's interesting you bring that up, and we're going to take a caller, and then we're going to go to a break. But afterwards, I do want you to hold that thought, because I do. If you like going out on a limb, I'm going to put you on another one. But for right now, let's go to the phones. We have a caller from Texas. Johnny, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on the line with Father Chad Hatfield.
Hi, Johnny.
Johnny, are you there? Hi, Johnny. Okay, we're not sure why he can't hear us. Johnny, you want to try one more time? Johnny, if you're listening to us, maybe what you can do is hang up and then call back in, and we will take your call, okay? All right, so Father Chad, let's do this. I'm going to ask you that question now. And this one requires, again, going out on a limb a little bit. So, first of all, thank you for the podcast Schmemann Speaks.
Oh, yes.
This has been a real gift. And anybody that listens to podcasts, no matter what podcast that you, podcast provider you go to, just type in Schmemann. It will come up. It's called Schmemann Speaks, and you actually hear his voice. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of these particular podcasts in his voice.
Well, we discovered that reel-to-reel recordings had already disintegrated. We lost them. What a tragedy. Oh, no. And so we had a lot of cassettes, and the Farah Foundation actually assisted us in digitizing them. Alexandra Popovich took that task on, and after we all began to sort of listen again, some were better quality than others because of how they were recorded. But then more and more people began saying to us, oh, I have this one, or I bet you don't have this one. So we began to collect them. And as you said, it's available at sfats.edu, and you can get it through Apple or Spotify or Google Podcasts, a lot of platforms. But I've been quite touched by how many people say, I never knew he had such a tremendous voice.
Oh, yeah. He has a great voice.
Totally captivated there.
Oh, yeah.
And then that's tied to one of our latest books, which is A Voice for Our Time, the English translations of his podcast through Radio Liberty into the former Soviet Union. And Volume 2 will be out like just any day now. But people discovered that, and it's like we want to know more and more and more. So any of you who have some tapes that you'd like to share with us, we'd be happy to actually work on that and get it onto the podcast.
Great idea. So here's my one quick question. We're going to go to a break, and then we've got Johnny back on the line. So, in the A Voice for Our Time, the idea that Father Alexander is recognizing that there was a challenge in the former Soviet Union. He recorded these messages to the people behind the Iron Curtain. You've somewhat taken that idea and you said that this message of warning about communism, warning about the sort of totalitarianism is a message that also resonates with us today. So here's my question. You have two camps that seem to be vying for Father Alexander's legacy. One camp is, I would say, kind of fancies themselves as the inheritors of a sort of a liberal, not in the sense of political, although it could be, but a kind of a liberal thought that we might recognize coming out of Paris and the Parisian intellectuals and so forth. Whereas another camp is saying, no, listen to his messages. He had very conservative values. He had, he's warning about paganism and the society slipping back into a sort of secularism. Here's the question. Where do you see him?
Well, that's a very good question. I'd preface it with a few things. People forget how well read Father Alexander was. If you looked at his library, I'm told, to hear him lecture on Russian literature apparently was like fantastic. But Dostoevsky, all of that, it's there. And he was able to interpret that to people. And another thing that people forget is his relationship with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That was quite an era in the history of St. Vladimir Seminary. And certainly they weren't on the same page with everything. But those exchanges were very important. And, there's the famous Solzhenitsyn graduation address at Harvard. Where, again, he was almost prophesying where we would find ourselves today. But I would also say this. Many people also forget that Father Schmemann was a supporter of the Vietnam War. His son Serge served there. Why? Because he was very anti-communist, and he believed in the domino theory. He also believed in America. That's a lesson for us from the time, but that's where he was.
Interesting.
And also, in 1975, he was one of the signers of something which is known as the Hartford Appeal. Now, that's a remarkable document which received widespread publicity at the time. Mainstream American media picked it up, and in large part because of the prestige of its co-signers. And it lamented in basically 13 specific propositions. This is a quote: "An apparent loss of a sense of the transcendent, a reduction of salvation and the meaning of moral good to human fulfillment, relativism among the world's religions, and a worldly agenda for the world instead of a Christian agenda for the world." That's where he's coming from. Probably if I were to ask you, I bet you would know, because so many of his former students know this, but his definition of secularism was, above all, a negation of worship. Now that's remarkable and worth pondering. So for me, Father Tom, that's where he's coming from. And I actually contributed a chapter to a book that was published by Holy Trinity Seminary in Jordanville. The title of the book is Healing Humanity, Confronting Our Moral Crisis. But my chapter is titled The Eucharist as Antidote to Secularism, Insights from a 20th Century American Orthodox Perspective. And that's my understanding of Father Schmemann and his teaching. And he always oriented us back to the Eucharist. Always.
Excellent. We're going to explore that topic of secularism a little bit more on the other side of the break. Let's take a quick break. When we come right back, we're going to go to the phones, and then we can take your phone calls too. 1-855-AF-RADIO. We'll be right back.
Father Tom will be back in a moment. In the meantime, the lines are open at 855-237-2346. Don't go away.
It began in 2004 with one streaming station playing Orthodox hymns and chants in many different languages, and a few talk programs and lectures as we could find them. About 10 years later, we added a talk channel and made the music channel, well, all music. Today, I'm pleased to announce a third streaming channel on Ancient Faith Radio, introducing the English Language Music Channel. You now have 3 choices on the Ancient Faith app and website. Share the good news with your friends and family. And as always, thanks so much for your financial support that makes it all possible.
Back with Ancient Faith Today and Father Tom Soroka. Give us a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Father Tom.
We're back with Father Chad Hatfield, and we're talking about the legacy of Father Alexander Schmemann. Father Chad, let's go to the phones. We're going to try Johnny from Texas one more time. Johnny, welcome to Ancient Faith Today. You're on the line with Father Chad Hatfield.
Thank you so much. Great conversation. Can you hear me?
I can hear you clear.
Excellent. Father Hatfield, I was wondering if you could comment on Father Schmemann's understanding of the anamnesis. In a lecture that he delivered to Oxford on May 25th, 1982, he said, its unique function, referring to the liturgy, is to reveal to us the kingdom of God. This is what we commemorate eternally, the remembrance. That anamnesis of the kingdom is the source of everything else in the church. I was wondering, how would you interpret that?
Well, I actually think your quote sums it up really well. That's where he would be coming from. That's why it was important to pray the anaphora out loud, so people heard their salvation history every Sunday. For a Jew, when they gather at the Passover once a year, their salvation history is rehearsed for them in that meal. Well, for us, every time we gather in the Eucharistic assembly, it's rehearsed for us because we so easily forget.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. That that was one of those key words, Johnny, that he would constantly use, this anamnesis, that the idea that we are remembering, but remembering not just in the sense of, like I remember thoughts of my mother, but this remembrance is much more profound because it brings to our presence, we enter into this mystery of Christ's saving passion, of his redemptive work. This is really the idea of having all of these feasts and liturgies and so forth, that we are entering into them. And that's really what Father Alexander emphasized again and again.
Sure. It's like our liturgical language, today he is ascended. It's not something in the past, it's today.
Yeah.
Exactly. Johnny, any thoughts on that?
That's excellent. In the Philokalia, there's a parallel to this anamnesis called the Nimi Theou, the remembrance of God, and it's everywhere. Especially Saint Gregory of Sinai really emphasized that. So it's going back to what you guys were talking about, was that Father Schmemann wasn't really innovating. He was bringing us back to remembering things of the past, getting back to the original.
It is really true. And Father Chad, if you don't mind me just putting my 2 cents in on that particular subject, because, we do want to get to the whole sort of mythology question, but, as someone who was there, there's this myth that, as Father Chad said, that he was somehow bringing Vatican II into the Orthodox Church, that there was this tremendous upheaval of reform that was going to happen. But the reality was, at St. Vladimir's, that never happened. The place where he was the leader, the place where he was actually implementing the things that he believed in, there were 0 changes to the service. In no way were there any cuts or changes or anything like that. There were no sort of weird things going on, and that is the best testimony to the idea that he was, as Father Chad said, restoring what was correct and true and right in our services.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Johnny. Appreciate it very much. Father Chad, we have another caller. We have Christopher from New Mexico. Christopher, you're on the air with Father. Yeah, hi. You're on the air with Father Chad Hatfield. Welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. Hello, Father Tom. This is Christopher in Capera.
Hey, Chris. How are you? Away. Good to see you.
Good.
Good to hear you, should say.
Yeah. My question for Father Chad, I agree with Father Chad about Father Schmemann being almost a prophet about secularism in our age, how it had filtered into the church from the Middle Ages on up to the present time. My question is, who, if anybody, or where is that work specifically about secularism being a negation of worship, being a heresy of man, not of God? Where is that work continuing, if anywhere, within Orthodoxy? I see it in some Roman Catholic and Protestant circles. And, of course, Father Chad invited Rod Dreher to give the Schmemann lecture this year. But Rod Dreher has his limitations. He's a journalist. He's not a technical academic theologian, obviously. Is there anybody or anywhere where that kind of work is continuing, particularly, given what's happened in the last 50 years around the sexual revolution and all the very radical changes occurring in our culture?
Great question.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I might say that Rod Dreher's invitation to give the Schmemann lecture, not understood by some people, cheered by others, was because of his own work in reaching out and interviewing people who were the audience that Schmemann was trying to reach in his Radio Liberty broadcast into the former Soviet Union. And if you read Rod's preface to the book, he captures it. So, again, it's not a case of trying to put Schmemann where he shouldn't be. It was actually more of a case of trying to match a modern voice to someone who was understanding the red flags that Schmemann was raising in his time. But, you ask, where's this work being done? I don't mean this in a flippant way, but I think certainly at this theological seminary, we're addressing those things, because this is a place to continue in the footsteps of the legacy of Father Schmemann. We're preparing the priests and the lay leaders of the Orthodox Church for the future generations, and we have to address the things that are hitting us in our time. In my opinion, we've gone from being a post-Christian culture to being anti-Christian, aggressively anti-Christian on many fronts. We're seeing this rise of neo-paganism. And certainly the nuns and duns, which get a lot of track, having been identified with those labels from a Pew survey a few years ago, many of them have walked away from a sort of an anemic expression of Christianity, and they're looking for something much deeper. That's why you hear people say things like, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. You go into major bookstores and you see the largest section is some form of quote-unquote spirituality. People are searching, but unfortunately they have a very hard time finding Orthodox Christianity because we're still sort of consuming ourselves. We have yet to figure out how to, with gentleness and kindness, bring the light of Christ into a world that seems to be getting darker all the time.
Very good. Christopher,
okay, thank you
any
very
comments, reflections?
Gosh, I think, it's obviously occurring. We live in a very turbulent time, obviously, where change is happening very fast. And I see the differences in generations, the older generations within the Orthodox Church as opposed to the younger. Now I'm in my 50s. Now I'm becoming part of that older generation myself. I guess sometimes I'm not sure. I see Rod Dreher doing it, and of course, Father Chad is from a seminary standpoint, and of course that is important. But the Church, of course, is more than her clergy, and I am struck by just how secularized, not necessarily through any fault of their own. It's just where we live. It's the culture where we live. How secularized the average man in the pew, if I can use that phrase, is. And earlier in the program, you both of you spoke to the liturgy being a tool to bring Christ to us. I sometimes wonder, well, is that enough though? Because we're only at the liturgy so little compared to how often we're how long we're out into the world and being formed by the world. And of course, I have young children. I see that as well. So I don't know. It seems like I read Father Schmemann and I read Rod, and it's like, okay, well, here's a beginning, but it's only a beginning. And I don't know. Sometimes I want to reach out and say, okay, where else? Where else can where? It seems like something more needs to take place, and I know that's very vague, and I apologize for.
No, I follow what you're saying, and I think the idea that Father Chad was saying is that in a way Father Schmemann was prophetic because he was speaking about what we actually are going through today. And so, if it seems like we're going to have to be a little bit more direct, where Father Schmemann was speaking in some generalities. And it would be fascinating to raise up the new Father Alexander who could point us in the right direction. Chris, thank you so much for your phone call. I appreciate it very, very much. God bless you. Father Chad, we have a question on the on Facebook, and it says, I've heard so much about Father Schmemann. This is from Deacon Alexei in Minneapolis. I've heard so much about Father Schmemann. Where would I start to understand Father Schmemann's outlook and teaching in reading or elsewhere?
Well, my day job is selling books, SVS Press. But the book which we recently published, it was edited by Paul Gavriluk. It's titled On Christian Leadership, The Letters of Alexander Schmemann and Father George Florovsky, 1947 to 1955. It is a remarkable read. And, Father Tom, you've mentioned sort of myths and other such things. This book really helped me to understand both of those men in a much deeper way. And particularly, the early history, where they were working together, and then this very, very painful time of separation. And you actually, get the real sense of the two men. And there's a couple of visions that I would say, now as the president of the seminary, that I picked up on, and this would help you, Deacon Alexei, to recognize the character of both of these men. Father Florovsky...
Father Chad, before you go on, just explain, because some people don't know that there was a separation between the two of them. So what was that separation before you...
Yes.
You had mentioned the separation.
Well, Father Florovsky actually is the one who courted bringing Father Alexander and his family from Paris to the seminary, which was in those days, of course, located down by Columbia University in the city.
Yeah.
And there was a tension. And part of it was the vision. Father Florovsky, in his brilliance, really saw St. Vladimir's as the academy in the classic Russian tradition of being higher education. He understood we needed a clergy and a lay leadership that was highly educated because America was becoming a highly educated society. It was very much a kind of university model. Father Alexander had a different vision, and that was we need to have high academics, but it needed to be blended into the pastoral formation. And he also was very much focused on what we would call today the spiritual formation of the candidates for holy orders. And it was actually Schmemann's vision for the seminary that actually sort of won out. And eventually Father Florovsky was removed as dean. We had that long period of time where Metropolitan Leonti of blessed memory was the dean before Father Alexander became dean in 1962.
So how was that resolved then in the writing in this book about leadership and about these two men? How would you say that what is the lesson that we learned there, and how was this resolved?
Well, I would say as two Christian priests, in the book you will read Father Alexander's final letter to Father Florovsky where he was seeking reconciliation. That letter was never answered, but it's also very moving that in Father Alexander's last days, he has a vision of Father Florovsky and a reconciliation. It's quite moving.
Wow, that's amazing. Wonderful. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. We do have a few minutes before the end of the show, so if you'd like to call in with a question or comment, we would love to hear from you. Father Chad, so... let's just talk a little bit more before we close the program about some of the issues that Father Alexander confronted in his day. Let's try to get more specific now because, we did say there was things like infrequent communion. People were not going to communion. There was the idea of the services being in a foreign language. What were some of the other issues that Father Alexander confronted in his work as a sort of acknowledged leader of parish growth and parishioner understanding and enlivening of orthodoxy.
Well, if you read the collection of his homilies, 3 volumes that SVS Press published, you can see him as the teacher. And as you said earlier, he traveled. He traveled abroad, but domestically he was everything from major addresses at universities into the parishes. And he understood the church year in a remarkable way. If you, for instance, you take his book, Great Lent, Journey to Pasca, that's still a book that for many people is an awakening. They begin to move through and understand Great Lent in a way they never did before. And this is one that not a lot of people understand as well. I think his teaching on Mariology, and in fact, you mentioned, the Schmemann Speaks podcast. We've got 2 new ones coming out any day. That's him speaking on the place of the Theotokos in the life of a Christian. So as a teacher, and particularly moving away from an understanding of confession and communion being 2 things tied together as one unit. You will, of course, recall he sort of introduced the concept of general confession, which again was controversial in a lot of circles.
Sure, right.
But that was just to get people better prepared to make their own private confession.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. He felt strongly that people needed to make a better confession, and he wanted to use that as a vehicle to teach them. I think eventually it sort of did fall out of favor. It was, being abused by some people, but I think it was certainly very, very well intentioned. Yeah. So, Father, in these last few minutes that we have, let's maybe try to talk a little bit with sensitivity, because you and I are both lovers of Father Alexander, and we want people to think the best of him. We don't, we're not trying to write a hagiography of him, but I believe objectively there are just some false ideas about Father Alexander that are out there by his detractors. Could you maybe comment a little bit on that? What are some of the things that you've heard about Father Alexander that you just feel are not correct?
Well, I think we've been clear, about liturgical reform, which, there were parts in Eastern Europe where they were burning his books after the fall of communism. I look at the situation in Serbia, particularly today. Serbia has those who sort of lean to a kind of Schmemann understanding of the liturgy, and then there are those that are at the other extreme, that, somehow or another he was working for the dark side. But again, most of these people have not read him. They don't understand him. And, sometimes people say, well, he would be, for all of the avant-garde things, his teaching on the ordination of women to the priesthood is a voice that we need to hear today. And again, many people say, well, that's locked in a particular time period. Well, not when you actually examine his understanding of the theology of priesthood. And I think there's another area that's not related to anything we've talked about here, which is autocephaly. Yes. We cannot forget the role of Father Alexander in bringing the gift of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in America. And again, you want to put me out on a limb? I'll go right out on a limb.
Yeah,
I think
sure,
I think American Orthodoxy is as balkanized as it's been in decades. Mm-hmm. And we once again we need to return to Schmemann and begin to get that vision of the coming storm.
I agree. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. He was the champion of understanding that we have to be one church. He worked very, very hard, of course, receiving the autocephaly and being a main character in that entire drama that happened. But, of course, he would, I think, be appalled at the divisions in our church today.
I agree.
Father Chad, thank you so much for your insight and your leadership, especially in this important year. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth. We are reflecting on all the good that Father Alexander did, and sometimes it saddens me, when I read some of the comments on the internet that are just simply wrong. And somewhat unkind and mean, because they didn't understand the context in which he was working, in which he was writing. And I think that we both can agree that we are enjoying the fruits of his work today, without which I think we would be a very, very different church in America.
Oh, I think without a doubt you've hit the nail on the head, Father Tom.
Father Chad Hatfield, President of St. Vladimir Seminary, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Best wishes as you go into, pretty soon, your new academic year. We wish you all of God's blessings. Tell us, if you can, just since you said your day job is to sell books, how can people find some of these wonderful books of Father Alexander? Where can they go?
Well, SVS Press has its own website. You can certainly go there. Most parish bookstores and others, have them in stock. So go to the website. It's easy to order there. And that's also where you'll find on the seminary website this podcast that we're talking about, for those of you that would actually like to hear Father Schmeman's own voice.
Indeed. Thank you very, very much, Father Chad. Wish you all the best. Appreciate your presence very, very much. And we also want to acknowledge, by the way, that Father Chad joined us through the brand new Ancient Faith Radio studio that is at St. Vladimir Seminary in the library there. So we're very, very happy about that. And we look forward to a lot of great things coming out of St. Vlad's, out of that Ancient Faith Radio studio. Thank you very much, Father Chad.
You're welcome. It's great to have this partnership.
Absolutely. Before I share a few final thoughts, I do, again, want to offer my sincere thanks to Father Chad Hatfield for joining us tonight. Thanks to Trudy for engineering the program, for everybody that listened in, and for our callers. Here's a few final thoughts. You may have seen around the Thanksgiving time the very short sermon that Father Alexander preached on his last sermon, his last public divine liturgy, which was in 1981, I believe, 1981, 1982. And so he wrote these words, and he gave these words to us, and they have become timeless words, and it is called, "Thank You, O Lord." He says, "Everyone capable of thanksgiving is capable of salvation and eternal joy. Thank you, O Lord, for having accepted this Eucharist, which we offered to the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and which filled our hearts with the joy, peace, and righteousness of the Holy Spirit. Thank you, O Lord, for having revealed yourself unto us and given us the foretaste of your kingdom. Thank you, O Lord, for having united us to one another in serving you and your holy church. Thank you, O Lord, for having helped us to overcome all difficulties, tensions, passions, temptations, and restored peace, mutual love, and joy in sharing the communion of the Holy Spirit. Thank you, O Lord, for the sufferings you bestowed upon us, for they are purifying us from selfishness and reminding us of the one thing needed, your eternal kingdom. Thank you, O Lord, for having given us this country where we are free to worship you. Thank you, O Lord, for the school where the name of God is proclaimed. Thank you, O Lord, for our families, husbands, wives, and especially children who teach us how to celebrate your holy name in joy, movement, and holy noise. Thank you, O Lord, for everyone and everything. Great are you, O Lord, and marvelous are your deeds, and no word is sufficient to celebrate your miracles. Lord, it is good to be here. Amen. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening for another edition of Ancient Faith Today. Good night, everybody.
Linking the ancient Christian faith with modern technology. You're listening to internet-based Ancient Faith Radio.
Yevma Tech, a payment technology company established by Orthodox Christians, helps parishes offer an easier giving experience without complex apps or online payments. Yevma also offers innovative tools for managing special events and festivals. For more information, go to yevma.tech/AFR.
Reading through the entire Bible in just 1 year. To an average person in today's busy world, it seems like a daunting challenge. But in the Orthodox Daily Scriptures podcast, Father Alexis Khoury makes it a journey that is not only rewarding, but simple and accessible as well.
They buried their bones under the oak tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his lawlessness, which he committed against the Lord according to the word of the Lord, because he did not keep it, and because Saul sought counsel of a wizard, and Samuel the prophet answered him. So he slew him and turned the kingdom over to David.
To find this podcast and others like it, you can go to ancientfaith.com.
This is Ancient Faith Today with Father Tom Soroka, a weekly live call-in show addressing the issues of our day from a distinctly Orthodox perspective. You can join the conversation by calling in at 855-237-2346. That's 855